all right, I've talked a lot about the benefits and the strategy, but how do you actually create tangential content? So let's get into some of the nitty gritty. This is a fun little diagram I put together that hopefully is at all helpful. So let's take an example of PIN again and say employee communications is the industry you work in, or not even the industry, but like that's the topic that you cover as a company, okay? That's too specific. If you want to create tangential content, let's first zoom out. So employee communications, zooming out, maybe that's company culture. I mean, we're talking about how people relate to each other at work. A broader topic could be company culture, right? That does feel much broader. It encompasses a lot of topics. Also, employee communications is related to workplace productivity. I mean, part of the reason you have these things is that people can better talk to one another and understand what they're working on and become more efficient. So the more general topic might be workplace productivity. So as a result of this exercise of zooming out, you can have these two buckets. Like, let's try one of these two. Now it's time to zoom back in. What in company culture could be interesting to write about? You can talk about transparency. There's been a lot of conversation around this in terms of salaries, right? And then posting jobs and whether you should include salaries. Transparency is a very interesting topic related to company culture. Your work friendships, that could be a fun one that a lot of people can relate to. Almost everybody has had a friend at work, and like what is that dynamic like? And then on the workplace productivity side, you can talk about things like time tracking, which is controversial. You can talk about the 4-day work week. It's been really trendy these days, right? So like how much time should you actually be working, and what actually is the most productive is an interesting debate that's going on. And then within both of these categories is remote work, which I'm realizing is why we've done a lot of stories on remote work for PIN, because it kind of falls into both buckets. Your company culture is dramatically impacted by whether you're in office or working remotely or a mix of both. And there's conversations around how productive people are when they work from home, right? So it's a great example of both. So this is just an example of how you take a topic of a specific topic that you're in, that your company's focused on, you zoom out first, you zoom back in, and now you have an assortment of subtopics that you can start brainstorming about that aren't specifically your product or service offering. But they're also not too far removed. And that's the other key here. You can't just be like, we're going to talk about pet insurance. It's like, that makes no sense and nobody will ever pick that up, because why are you talking about that? Still relevant to your target audience is still relevant to your general industry. So once you have those subtopics, that's the start, because those aren't necessarily content ideas. They're just categories. You can talk about the 4-day work week, but people are already talking about the 4-day work week. So what can you uniquely add? So these are 3 questions that I recommend adding to your brainstorming strategy. So the first one, and we're going to dive into each of these, so we'll talk more about them, but the first one is how you can be of service to your audience. Again, that speaks to outside of your specific brand, and it kind of gets you thinking about what else you can offer. Number 2 is what is the greater context you can add to trending topics. I think the 4-day work week is a great example of like where that's a challenge that has been at least all over LinkedIn that I've seen in the last several months. What can you add to the conversation that's different than what's already being talked about? And then number 3, what data can you analyze or present in a new way to provide a new perspective? So if you're able to use these questions as a framework, at least for your brainstorming, it'll put you in the right direction to come up with an idea that's going to meet the criteria that I talked about and get you some of these results that we are all looking for. So I'll break down each one. How can I be of service to my audience? So when I joined Stacker, this was like one of the biggest things I learned that I didn't really think about in my previous jobs, because service journalism is the thing. And I hadn't heard this phrase. So service journalism is literally those pieces of content that are like, here's how to change your tire, or here's how to figure out how you should be investing in your retirement, right? They're literally designed to help you accomplish something. We see this a lot in marketing, actually. You see the how-to posts are very popular. But to think more specifically outside of maybe even keyword research and more like general, Some people do that kind of keyword research. If you've only done more bottom of the funnel keyword research, that won't help you. But if you've done more top of the funnel keyword research as well, that could be where this comes into play if you're looking at how-tos that are more general. So as an example, if we talk about business insurance, a topical question your audience probably has is, how do I get it? Or how do I pick the right business insurance for me? Those are bottom of the funnel questions. Where tangentially, if you're doing question research or keyword research, you might get questions like, what does it take to start a business? That's a very different question that appeals to people who will seemingly will eventually start a business and then be interested in business insurance. So it's not too far out of the realm, but it also probably has a higher volume of searches. I think a lot of people have thought, what goes into this process? And giving that information to somebody in a clear way where it's very useful to them is an example of service journalism in a tangential way. So just wanted to note some tools you can use in order to do this. SparkToro, if you take the SparkToro approach, it basically allows you to see where certain audiences are consuming other information online. So if you're like, oh, in my industry, this podcast is super popular, you can see where people who listen to that podcast are also consuming information, and you can see what kind of content they're publishing. And it's a good way to just see the types of topics that are being covered in your industry. Obviously, things like Google News and exploding topics are more about just seeing what's topically happening that maybe questions are forming around. But then you get into more specific, like Answer the Public is literally gathering questions from all over the internet and presenting them to you. But actually, BuzzSumo is the one that's gathering them all over the internet. Answer the Public is doing autocomplete. So whatever it is, any tool that's collecting questions and presenting them to you is, these are questions that are being asked online that potentially you can answer. And Keyword Surfer, whatever keyword research tool or plugin of your choice, again, more top of the funnel approach, though, not a bottom of the funnel approach. So thinking, what are people searching in general in my industry? So then we talk about context. This is the other thing that I learned at Stacker. So they are all about contextualizing. And this is really interesting from a brand standpoint, because we tend to want to be the news, like, wow, we're releasing this product and everyone's going to care. It's so cool. And like, really, most people don't care. And it's good to not think of ourselves as the stars, but rather as the complementary piece of what any journalist is working on. And to think of that's an interesting perspective shift, I think. And it also puts you in the right path to understand how you can actually benefit that journalist and their readers. So just on the top level, not even these questions, at the top level, contextualizing and complementing is just a good mentality to go into this with. Instead of trying to break news, how can you add something to that story? So some questions you can ask, what is the history of this? And that's not always going to be super compelling. But sometimes it is, and it's overlooked. I think a lot of breaking news can be very interestingly contextualized if we look at how it got to this point. And a lot of Stacker stories have done that very successfully. No more main character syndrome. Yes, I love that. How does it compare to other similar things? It's hard to illustrate this super well, like comparing to similar different things. But an example that one of the Stacker partners told me was, if you think about like the budget, right? Like the congressional budget or whatever it is, and they're saying, okay, let's talk about educational, the amount of money we're going to give to education. How does that compare to previous years? How much did they give in previous years? And how does that compare to other budgets, either in the same department or completely different? How does it compare to military spending, for example? All of those have value, right? They're adding a different perspective and taking the same fact or data point or event and looking at it differently. And that's what I want to challenge all of us to do, because just because something's been talked about doesn't mean it's been talked about comprehensively and in a way that's like there are no other opportunities to shed light on something. Okay, actually, I think I skipped there. I was like, I skipped a slide. Okay, data. I was like, this is an important slide. Data is, if you've never done this work before, I'd say start here, because I think data is the best and easiest way to get coverage. The reason being, especially if you're a brand that a publisher has not heard of or a reader has not heard of, you really need a solid methodology to earn their trust. And if you have a data set that you analyzed, it goes much further in earning that trust quickly, rather than them trying to figure out how you collected this project that you put together and it's not clear what your methodology was or what data you used. There's a lot of publicly available data out there. I mean, just government sites alone, there's a ton of really interesting stuff. If you have internal data, certainly worth using, but with a caveat that it has to be pretty comprehensive and unbiased. So, you know, there are big companies that do this and they make sense. Like Spotify can put really awesome lists together of what people are listening to, right? But we're not all that size and we don't all have that kind of access. So it only makes sense if you're the type of company that has a lot of internal data that they can analyze in a way that's really compelling. If you did a survey of like your 200 employees, that's probably not good enough, is my point. And then manually collected. So if you do run more comprehensive surveys, if you do manual interviews, even whatever it is, where you're just like going out there, we've done stories where we've collected all in one place a bunch of different sources to kind of just make sense of a complex topic. Something like that would be more manually collected. Any of these things, if you can do this, will get you very far. Data has a lot of bonus benefits. It could be broken down by demographic, by location. It adds that authority piece that I mentioned. Sometimes it feels even more newsworthy because you're presenting a whole new like data point that nobody's really thought about. I think this is a really good way to break into the tangential content area.
Now, if you liked this Clearscope webinar snippet, don't forget to share, like, and subscribe so you don't miss out on more great tips and strategies from the industry's best SEOs and content marketers. Make sure to check out the Clearscope YouTube channel for more great content.